Join us as we dive into the history, hauntings, and high strangeness of the world to try to better understand the paranormal. I will be your guide. I am paranormal researcher and investigator Eric Freeman-Sims. Welcome to the Unseen Paranormal Podcast. Hey everybody, we have a great show for you today. Thanks for joining us. We are chatting with Gettysburg historian, author, and tour guide Mark Nesbitt. Mark is a former Gettysburg park ranger, owner of Ghosts of Gettysburg Tours, and author of the Ghosts of Gettysburg series of books. You can find his series of books and more of Mark's books on Amazon Kindle and wherever fine books are sold. For more info on the tours of Gettysburg, you can check out Mark's website, ghostsofgettysburg.com. Hey Mark, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me, Eric.
Not a problem. So I've dove into some other Civil War stuff here on the show, other Civil War sites, specifically around Tennessee where I live. But I saw you on another show or heard you on another show. And so I was like, I need to dive into Gettysburg. That's, infamously haunted Civil War battlefield and town.
Yes, it is.
So how did you, because like I said in the intro, you were a park ranger there at the Gettysburg battlefield. So how did you get into the paranormal side of things?
Well, that's actually how it started. I was a park ranger there for, I believe, 6 years. And being the bachelor at the time there, they moved me around to several of the houses. The park rangers live in the beautiful historic houses that you see out on the battlefield for security reasons. And I'd been to about 2 or 3 of them, and then I ended up in the National Cemetery Lodge. If you've been to Gettysburg, it's the big brick building right there in the cemetery. And I'd had experiences though in just about every other house that I'd been in, things that, you can't explain, doors that won't stay closed, footsteps and that, you write it off to the house settling or something.
Yeah.
Of course, I'd heard some of the other park rangers who'd lived in those houses had the same experiences. So my interest was kind of piqued about, you live on the Gettysburg battlefield, you're going to think a little bit about whether or not the place is haunted. And so I remember it was the middle of the day. I was cleaning up after lunch, and I was in the cemetery lodge, and I was taking my dishes out to the kitchen to wash them, which is a highly unusual, possibly paranormal experience in itself, me cleaning up after myself. But I got about halfway to the kitchen, and all of a sudden I heard a baby cry or a child cry, a baby cry. And I'm like, what the heck was that? And I actually stopped. And, I'm trying to explain it, something in the pipes, but no, it was a kid crying. So I walked, I put my dishes away, and I thought about it for several days afterwards, and then I realized that just down the street from the cemetery lodge was the old children's orphanage that was established right after the Civil War for all the children who became orphans. Not all the children, but many of the children that became orphans because of the American Civil War. And I remembered that I'd read about the second matron there. The first matron was a very nice woman. Second matron was like something out of a horror movie. She used to punish the kids and virtually torture them and leave the kids outside on cold winter nights until they cried. And then it struck me, is that what I heard? Did I hear, a paranormal echo of the past? So that kind of got me interested. And I told some of my colleagues about it in the coffee room, and they said, you need to talk to such and such who lived there before. I said, okay. And sure enough, she had heard this numerous times, this baby crying, child crying. So that got the wheels moving. And I started, asking questions. And people would literally come into the park and ask, are there any ghosts at such and such a place? And we're like, why? Well, I think I might have seen a ghost out there. And they'd tell us their story. So I just started jotting these things down, and started keeping track of them. And sure enough, probably, I know it was at least 10 years after I left the Park Service, I thought I had enough for a book, so I approached the local publisher, and he said, "Sure, go ahead, put it together." That book came out in 1991, Ghosts of Gettysburg, and it was very, very popular. And so after I wrote that book, I started getting phone calls and letters and faxes. This is before tweets and Twitter and stuff like that. And it basically was people saying, "Okay, my neighbors are wrong. I'm not crazy. Here's what happened to me at Gettysburg." They didn't want to. You don't want to say anything. Something weird like that, like a ghost happens to you in Gettysburg. And so that's how I started collecting the stories and actually publishing the stories. And then from then on, it just kind of snowballed from there.
Yeah. And also with you starting before all the TV shows and that type stuff. And that was back when, ghosts and hauntings and all that wasn't really prevalent in the pop culture like it is today. And so people were a little more reticent to put themselves out there with their ghost stories and what happened to them.
Well, now it's they want to have a ghost experience so they can be on TV. So,
right.
But back then, no, in fact, Ghosts of Gettysburg, which was actually a 2-part series that came out on TV on the History Channel, came out in 94 and 95, I believe. So that was really as one of the first ones to ever come out on TV, other than, a Halloween show periodically. This was specific to Gettysburg, and it did kind of, I like to think it did inspire some of the other ghost investigators, to go out and say, let's wait for some ghost stories. Let's see if we can investigate these things.
Right.
And I didn't get into the investigating part of it until probably 1994 or 1995, when a local fella, president of the Pennsylvania Paranormal Society, Rick Fisher, invited me out to the battlefield one night and was doing an investigation out there. He had one of these laser thermometers, and that's when those were in style. And he said, "I seem to be getting a lot of cold spots over there." And people were taking pictures, and they saw that they were getting these orbs. Now, of course, they're controversial. Orbs are controversial.
Right.
But I'm not going to, I've had enough experience with them to say, yeah, a lot of them are, dust, and a lot of them are bugs, but some of them I just can't explain. So at any rate, I walked out. I said, "Hey, I got to see what you're talking about here." So I walked out to where he was pointing, and it was kind of 50 degrees out on the battlefield, middle of Pickett's Charge, major battle site out there, pitch dark. And I'm standing out there. People are flashing their flashes, taking pictures. And they said, we're starting to see these orbs, these white lights starting to gather around you. And I'm like, "Oh, that's interesting." And sure enough, I started getting cold, and I got within 30 seconds, I got so cold I could hardly close my hand. It was really, really cold. I'm like, this is ridiculous. I'm getting out of here.
Yeah.
So I walked back to the group and I explained to them what happened, and they were showing me their pictures of me and all these white orbs gathering around me. I said, "Whoa, what's going on here?" And that's what actually got me interested in doing the paranormal investigating, rather than just a historian collecting folklore. I kind of became proactive and started going to the places. And, I lived in Gettysburg, for crying out loud. Doesn't get any better than that if you want to start doing paranormal investigating. You know what I mean?
Right.
Because I was familiar with the history of the sites. Whenever I wanted to try and get EVP, I could easily get my hands on the rosters of the dead and the wounded, the men who actually fought there, and attempt to communicate with some people who actually died on the spot. So that, and then later on, when I started the tours, I bought a Civil War building in Gettysburg, and right on the corner of Baltimore and Breckenridge Street, which is in the town, but the town was battlefield as well, because the troops, Confederate troops, took it over after the first day of the battle, the town, and we have a couple of bullet holes in our building, and have stories about what happened there. But what that did was give me a laboratory, basically. I could lock the place down in the wintertime,
yeah,
and do experiments in there. and have a controlled laboratory, basically. And so that was the next step. And it's continued since then. I mean, I don't get out as often anymore in terms of investigating, but it sure is available whenever I want to.
Yeah, and like you said, just being in a place like that with that huge history and kind of everywhere in town, that was the buildings that were around back during that time are haunted. They all have stories, and because was such a massive battle and such a huge part of history.
Well, that is true, and I'm glad you brought that up because so many people come to Gettysburg and they come into our office in the town there, and they say, "Where's the battlefield?" And the answer is, "You're on it."
Right.
Right. Wherever you go. I mean, the soldiers marched all the way from Fredericksburg, Virginia, which is 100 and some miles away from Gettysburg. They marched from Washington, D.C. to get to the battle. They spread out all over, probably within a circumference diameter of 30 or 40 miles, with Gettysburg as the center. So they hit, and especially cavalry, hit every back road and pig path in the vicinity just to make sure, they were the scouts. They had to make sure there were no enemy there. So, and then, of course, the town became active battlefield. On the first day, the Confederates were heading into town from the west and the north, and the Union troops came from the south. Believe it or not, the northern troops came from the south and tried to hold the Confederates off until more Union troops came up from Washington and the area down in Maryland. And it ended with the Union troops being driven through the town of Gettysburg. The Confederates were victorious, and then the Confederates remained in the town itself and basically occupied the town. Originally there were 2,400 people, about 400 buildings in town, and there are about 200 left.
Wow.
Of the original buildings. So we have more original buildings in Gettysburg, the town, than they do on the battlefield park. On the park, we have more historic original buildings in Gettysburg than in the famed Williamsburg, which is supposed to be, the centerpiece for historic buildings. Many of those are rebuilt.
Yeah.
So some paranormal theorists say that residual hauntings occur because the spirit energy is trapped in the building itself or in the construction materials of the building. Well, we sure have enough buildings in Gettysburg that are still there from the battle where men fought, were wounded, and died. So it's a pretty, it's quite an interesting town.
Yeah, yeah, and that's one of the things I wanted to talk to you about today. Like you said, it's not just the open battlefield that's the park now. It's the whole town.
That's correct.
Yeah, and especially if you're going there for the paranormal, for Ghost, the battlefield's part of it, but there's and I think part of that is because there's been kind of the famous video and pictures from the battlefield specifically that you kind of see on all these shows, like you're talking about the documentaries they've done on the History Channel and stuff. You've seen those pictures, and that's kind of what they focus on. They hadn't focused necessarily on a lot of the buildings.
Well, the other than the name Gettysburg, they purchased when they first started buying the battlefield and securing it for eventually the government to take over. They went to places that were named by the soldiers, like Devil's Den, okay, Little Round Top, the Field of Pickett's Charge, Culp's Hill, Cemetery Hill. That's where they went to purchase these and secure these battle sites. And the town of Gettysburg was just the name of the place. So they didn't really do any purchasing in town, which is probably good. Maybe a lot of the people in town didn't want to sell. A lot of the farmers out in the fields, were bankrupt right after the battle because, you get thousands of troops marching across your July corn or wheat. And because that's when the battle took place in July, it pretty much devastates that year's crop. And so many of them went bankrupt, and so they were happy to sell. But, in town, the damage was minimal. The Confederates really didn't do any damage other than, little pranks and stuff that put molasses on some lady's stairway and rip open her feather bed and throw the feathers all over it. Other than that, and the damage that was done by the surgeons when they did their operating in the various houses, but the people pretty much cleaned up in town and stayed where they were. In fact, many of them capitalized on the fact that tourists, if you want to call them that, started coming to Gettysburg within days of the end of the battle. After the armies left, they swarmed to Gettysburg, some of them to see what a battlefield looked like, which was pretty horrible. Others to try and find relatives, fathers, sons, husbands that may have been hurt. They heard that their unit was in the big battle, and so they rushed to the battlefield. And then some of the townspeople said, "Oh, you don't know where Little Round Top is? For $2, I'll take you there." So that was the beginning of tourism, and the guide service, which still goes on to this day.
So talking about the battlefield, there are a lot of places, like you mentioned, Devil's Den, that people have caught lots of activity. You got the Ghost Regiment kind of going around the battlefield, that famous video and some of the famous photographs from there.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Those are some of the first stories I heard. And people often ask me, where is the most haunted place in Gettysburg or on the battlefield? And, believe it or not, Eric, it changes, because some years I hear, a couple of years ago, I heard that it was the Spangler Spring area. And then for a while, it was the field of Pickett's Charge. There was a lot going on out there. But I would say probably the most consistently active place in Gettysburg would be Devil's Den, and then an adjacent field called the Triangular Field. Those two places are pretty active, and people have got a lot of photographs and video of what appears to be soldiers moving around, especially in the Triangular Field. They've gotten those. That's my first experience with EVP, the electronic voice phenomenon, was in the Triangular Field one night when I asked some questions and got some recordings. I mean, it's really, really in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the battlefield, and at night it's pretty quiet. And so I got some recordings there that shouldn't have happened. And I'd written a book about a guy called 35 Days to Gettysburg, about two soldiers who used their diaries, who were on a collision course heading towards Gettysburg, one Union, one Confederate. And the Confederate fought in the Triangular Field, and I had researched the rosters of the units, of his unit, and called them in basically to attention for pay, and then called out their names and got some clipped military answers like "here, sir," things like that on this tape in another time. So that's I've gotten some pretty good activity out there, not to mention my camera and two other cameras of people that I was with. All three of them went on the blink when we were trying to get pictures going through the Triangular Field. Then when we left, they all started working again. Strange things like that,
Yeah, and some of the stories that I've heard about Gettysburg too is come from reenactors when they're there doing their kind of thing, like camping or whatever, where they've had like these really incredible interactions with some of the spirits. Well, it would come to find out, they find out that they had to be spirits. Yeah.
A number of years ago in the 90s, they did the movie Gettysburg. And shortly after that movie, I got a letter from a guy out in California who sent me, it was 13 pages of just notes. He was an extra. And so he spent a month there. He sent me just notes, just a paragraph or two of the things that happened to him and his friends out there. And I used those in some of my books. But a couple of things that had happened. One, they saw a horseman come riding into camp, and they're kind of looking up. They just finished doing the shooting for the day, and he came riding in, and all of a sudden he looked around and disappeared.
Wow.
And a couple of other times they saw soldiers on the outskirts of, looking, and then they just wouldn't come in and they just disappeared. But I think that tells us something about the spirit world. If these spirits felt comfortable enough to kind of walk into a scene that they were familiar with, in other words, imagine yourself a ghost, and you look in there and you see all these guys dressed the way you are right now, like, and you smell the coffee and you smell the bacon, and you're like, hey, they're my pards.
Yeah.
Maybe I'll go talk with them. And you start walking in, and all of a sudden you realize, wait a minute, something's wrong here. And, that means that they can see us just like we can occasionally see them.
Right.
Which to me is kind of neat. It's kind of eerie, but it's kind of neat.
Yeah, to have something there that we can't all the time see, but maybe they can all the time see us. Or maybe we're ghosts to them and they're ghosts to us.
Well, that does open a can of worms. You don't know what to think about something like that, except that, we're being watched.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting, and that's why we all do this, is trying to figure out, what's going on there.
That's true. Yeah, yeah.
But also, there are lots of the buildings in town because, like you said, they fought within the town, and then also a lot of them were either hospitals or they were occupied by generals and that type of stuff as well.
Yeah, and some of them, the first thing they did when the armies went out to fight is the surgeons, who were all officers, or most of them officers, would commandeer the larger public buildings. And the soldiers then would, after stopping at an aid station, if they could make it that far, or field hospital, then they'd make their way back to some of the larger prominent buildings. And there was a college, there still is a college called Gettysburg College, and they had several buildings that were there, 3 buildings that were there at the time of the battle. There was the Lutheran Theological Seminary, basically another college, up on Seminary Ridge, which became one of the main battle scenes, and they had a large building there, a couple buildings actually. And then, of course, the town had its churches and the courthouse. And those public buildings became hospitals. And then eventually they didn't realize, Gettysburg was such a bloody battle, they didn't realize how many casualties they were going to get.
Yeah.
You can't anticipate that. And it was so huge and so much bigger than any of the other battles. Eventually those buildings overflowed into the private sector, and many houses along Baltimore, the main streets, Baltimore Street, High Street, Middle Street, through Gettysburg, became hospitals and had surgery in them. Ours did not. Didn't become a surgery room, but we do know from letters and interviews from the 2 women who lived there at the time that that Confederate soldiers did occupy it. They also, the first soldier they met prior to the Confederate occupation was a Union soldier who was wounded in the hand. They brought him in, bandaged his hand, and all of a sudden, here come the Confederates swarming into town and banging on the door. So they hide the guy up in their attic, our attic, and the Confederates are swarming through the house, tired, wounded. Were probably on the first floor. The second floor had sharpshooters in it. Somehow they knew they had to get the Union soldier out of there. So the younger woman in her teens kind of created a ruse, acted, maybe fainted or something like that. And the Confederates, she drew their attention, and they hustled the Union soldier out of the attic, and the stairs are still there in the upstairs of our house, out across what is now a kitchen up there, and onto the balcony and into the house next door. So they kind of saved him from going to a prison. But and then for the rest of the battle, the Confederates were occupying our house until the Confederate Army withdrew on the night of the 3rd and day of the 4th, and straightened out their lines and withdrew from the town. So, and you read accounts of the town afterwards, and it's pretty gruesome when you read it, and just hard to comprehend now. You can't imagine 51,000 casualties, but anyone from a big city, you're near Nashville, and I'm not sure what the stadium there holds, but I know like Yankee Stadium in New York holds 52,000 fans, and the Battle of Gettysburg was 51,000 casualties. That's just the guys that were killed or wounded or disappeared, missing. So anytime you see a shot of Yankee Stadium, you see how thick that is. It's pretty awesome to have that drop down on a town of 2,400 people. Actually, probably less than that, because the number of the men from Gettysburg took the livestock and went north, tried to save their livestock. And so it was mostly women, old men, and kids in Gettysburg, maybe 2,000, maybe than that, maybe 1,500, plus the surgeons to take care of all these wounded soldiers.
Yeah, I read in one of your books where you described how they collected the body parts and were like stacking them in ice houses and stuff until they could get them buried or whatever they did with them.
Yeah, there was that was one of the things that they did, is they found a cool area, usually a basement or something like that, to put the bodies in at first, and then of course afterwards they had to get them back out and bury them. The burial the system was kind of strange, or not for them, I guess. But first of all, the men that died at Gettysburg were buried twice, at least twice. The Union soldiers all the soldiers were buried where they fell on the battlefield. Okay, where they were shot and killed on the battlefield.
Yeah,
and there were hasty burials, so they were only maybe 6 to 8 inches below the ground, wrapped in their uniforms or maybe a blanket or hat over their face. Then in the ensuing weeks and months after the battle, the rains came, opened up the graves, and it was probably the housewives that were saying to their farmer husbands, "Look, there's a guy. He's coming out of the ground again, and he's not in good shape. You got to get him out of my garden." Well, they got in touch with their politicians and in Pennsylvania, and they gathered up enough money to buy 17 acres on Cemetery Hill, right next to the main cemetery in Gettysburg, and began exhuming the Union soldiers from the battle and reburying them in that nice, new, neat cemetery. And then, of course, on November 19th, 1863, Lincoln came to consecrate the ground where these men were buried. But those are just the Union soldiers. And the Confederates, the poor Confederates, remained on the battlefield, buried in those graves until 1870, 7 or 8 years after the battle.
Wow.
Until finally women down in the South, because the South was devastated monetarily after the war, till they finally got enough money together to exhume the body, hire someone to exhume the bodies and bring them south. And they now rest in many of the, I guess you'd call them national cemeteries around the South, Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, Laurel Grove Cemetery down in Savannah. And I mention this because one of the theories of why ghosts remain is because they were not buried in consecrated ground. They were not given a proper burial.
Yeah. And
so their souls are in turmoil until that happened. Of course, that happened to the poor Confederates here, more so than the Union soldiers. There's still some burials out there in the battlefield. The most recent one they got was, I believe, in 1996 or 97. They still found bones and buttons. Yeah. And so it was that recent that they were still finding body parts and then reburying them in the National Cemetery. So it still goes on. They're still out there.
Yeah, I live very close to Franklin, Tennessee. And, of course, there was a huge battle, a pretty good-sized battle at Franklin.
I've been there a couple times. Yeah, I know. That's an interesting battlefield.
Yeah, and something similar happened there because the Confederates, there's about 1,700 of them that died, and they just buried them where they fell in the town of Franklin. And the McGavick family who owned Carton Plantation, because the grave markers, they inscribed whatever information they knew about the soldier on these crude, pieces of wood or whatever they could put on a grave marker. And the McGavick family actually teamed up with the city and citizens in the town of Franklin, and the McGavicks donated 2 acres on their property, and they paid somebody they paid 3 men to go around and dig up all these bodies and then reinter them in this Confederate cemetery. And it's still there at Carton Plantation. All the bodies are still buried there, and they've got grave markers, but there's a lot that they separated them by state. But other than that, they really didn't know a lot about a lot of the soldiers. So the grave markers just have a number.
Right.
They have a cemetery book where you can go look, and whatever information they had about that soldier is in there.
That kind of stuff happened because imagine the horror of what a battlefield looked like shortly after the battle, especially in July. I guess Franklin was in November, but
yeah,
the bodies don't stay in good shape for very long. And and they didn't have dog tags, like in World War II.
Right.
They didn't have any personal identification, so they would have to go through their pockets. And maybe by then, for letters, to see if they had any ID on them. Some people would go through their pockets and trying to find food or trying to find money or something, and the letters would blow away, and that's why you had so many unknown. But I remember that cemetery, and that's got a few ghost stories associated with it at Carnton.
Yeah. Carnton, they don't do the paranormal there, but there's a lot of reports of hauntings there.
Yeah,
that I've heard a lot of them throughout my life.
Yeah, I like that. As much as you can like a battlefield, I thought they preserved that area of the house, and where I guess just recently they got around to buying up the property where some of the generals were killed. How many? 5 generals, Confederate generals, were killed in that charge.
I know there were 4 that they put on the porch at Carnton after they died.
Yeah, well, I think that's Claiborne was one that was killed out in front of the Union lines, and they just put in a monument to him. At least the last time I was there, they had just put it up.
Yeah, about 12 years ago, the Battle of Franklin Trust, who owns Carnton Plantation, they also own Carter House in Franklin. Yeah, they bought up. It actually was a golf course right there for a long time, right there by Carnton, and they actually went in and bought the golf course and the clubhouse and reclaimed the battlefield. Yeah, and put in a lot of the earthworks back in. And then there's a couple other sites around Franklin that they kind of bought up. They bought this one property that there was a Pizza Hut and a Domino's.
I remember that. We went there before there, and we saw the Pizza Hut. I'm like, this is a battlefield. And then the second time we went, they had it that was gone, and it looked a little bit better. It's like a park there now, I guess.
Yeah, they made a little park, and there's some cannons there and stuff. But yeah, they've been going around reclaiming a lot of that, which is kind of neat. And kind of like Gettysburg, Franklin has a lot of the same historic houses that were around. So you've got a lot of them that still have bloodstains on them and have stories, to where like downtown Franklin is, extremely haunted, because that's where the battle, like with Gettysburg, that's where the battle was fought, was within the streets and all that.
Oh, yeah. Well, that's another fascinating place. Like I said, I've been there a couple times, and it was interesting. You never get enough, I was like,
yeah,
I didn't learn enough. I got to get back there, because there's nothing like visiting a battlefield. That's where you really, I think, get a pretty good perspective, in my opinion.
Yeah. Would you say that Gettysburg is more active at certain times of year than others, or is it just kind of active all the time? That's
a good question. And, the answer is a little difficult, because the Gettysburg battle was fought on July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, 1863. And so people always ask, is the anniversary any more active? Well, there are a lot more people, because of the 4th of July weekend, visiting Gettysburg. In other words, there's a lot more opportunity for the ghosts to be seen or experienced, because there's so many more potential witnesses there. But I do get a lot of stories around the 4th of July. We also have a reenactment usually around that weekend. So you have to be very careful, because the reenactors like to play ghost. You'll see somebody, and then all of a sudden you'll hear, "Oh, but he disappeared." And I'm like, "Well, was there a tree near him when he?" "Oh, yeah." I said, "Well, he probably was a reenactor and ducked behind the tree just to be a ghost." But so I don't know if that logically you would say so many guys died on that anniversary that there'd be more hauntings. Then again, I've lived in Gettysburg all through the year for a number of years, and it seems like if you go out there, there's no specific time when the ghosts are particularly active. I don't think dusk and maybe close to dawn, they're a little more active. Doesn't have to be night. About half my stories, I've collected almost 1,000 stories from just Gettysburg alone. They're not all published, but and they're split down the middle. About half have occurred at night, and about half have occurred during the day. So I personally don't think that there's any, you don't have to do a paranormal investigation specifically at night. You can do it anytime. In fact, I had an interview yesterday with Amy Bruni from the and Adam.
Yeah. Kindred Spirits.
Yeah. Just yesterday. And we agreed that, she says, people like me to do these. They always ask me, why do I do these at night? And she said, I kind of say, well, kind of focuses your attention, and you're a little more in tune with your senses. She said, I think we have as many experiences in the daytime as we do at night. And I agreed because, the statistics are there and in terms of my stories that I've collected. So
yeah,
you can go in Gettysburg, and there are plenty of places that are quiet. That's probably the other problem with going to try and do a paranormal investigation during the weekend of the anniversary of the battle, is because there's so many people there. It's hard to get a quiet time or a place when somebody isn't moving around out in the woods. Whereas if you go in December, it might be a little colder, but you're pretty much guaranteed to be alone if you're out in the triangular field. They're not that many. There's still people out there, but they're not that many.
yeah. So what does the Park Service think about paranormal investigators out there? Because I know a lot of parks, they kind of frown upon it, and like the rangers won't tell you any stories or anything. I know like Smoky Mountain National Park out here in East Tennessee, they kind of stay tight-lipped about it. But how do they feel about ghost hunters and it being such a well-known place within the paranormal community?
Having seen it from both sides, having been a park ranger, I remember asking one of my early on, one of my bosses when I was still working there, and I asked, have you ever heard any ghost stories about the battlefield? He kind of laughed at me. He says, there are enough real, true stories, historically documented stories that scare the pants off you here in Gettysburg, things that actually happened to human beings, that you don't need a ghost story. But I think they don't want it to become a haunted. I mean, it is already. You can't deny it,
right?
Because of the I call it folklore. It's part of the story of Gettysburg. That these people before the battle were having experiences like any place else. It doesn't have to be because of the battle. I don't like the idea that the national park says, okay, we're just interested in these guys until they're dead and buried.
Right.
Then we don't care. But I guess they're trying to take the scientific, in air quotes, trying to go at it in a way that they can explain, which is the historical aspects of it.
Right.
So they changed their philosophy or the law actually here in Gettysburg, and it goes according to what superintendent's involved. That now instead of leaving the park open till 10 o'clock, they close it at sunset, which of course changes every day.
yeah.
But they have it posted that it's closed at sunset and opens at sunrise, which that's either indicative of they don't want anybody going out there and doing a paranormal investigation at night, or maybe they got cutbacks. I don't know. And they just can't put rangers out there at night anymore. But I know that, for example, it all depends on the superintendent. For example, we were starting ghost tours in Fredericksburg, Virginia. And I talked with the superintendent, and there is a famous ghost story about a woman who haunts one of the buildings there every 7 years. And it goes prior to the Civil War. It's George Washington was involved and that kind of stuff. And she supposedly walked in. It was that year. And I asked the superintendent, I said, are you going to lock everything down, call out the dogs, and, put up fences? He says, no, we're going to keep the place open. I said, what? He said, yeah, that's part of our folklore. And we're going to leave the area open, and we're going to have extra people there to tell stories. And, and sure enough, they stayed open till, I guess, midnight or 10 o'clock at night. And people really got a chance to see the place and spend time out there rather than trying to hurry through and get to another place. So it all depends on the superintendent and their attitude. I don't think there's any danger from ghost hunters in terms of damaging the park, which is the biggest concern that the Park Service has, is protect all the monuments out there. But I don't think that ghost hunters would do something like that. I think you have more to worry about with the political things now.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
With a can of paint, how people do that. But the ghost hunters want to protect the site. All the ones I know, they think it's a sacred place, and they don't want anything to happen to it. So I don't know. I can't get in the heads of the powers that be, but I know it is up to the individual park. I know they said something really weird a few years ago when they said they didn't want EMF meters on the park because they were metal detectors. And I said, that's exactly what I did. I said, well, let's just test this out because I had half a dozen different models, and I have a Civil War saber and I have a Civil War musket. And I took each one of them, turned it on, and I walked right up to the musket and I put the meter on the barrel of the musket and it didn't move. Obviously, it picks up electromagnetic waves,
Right.
not the magnetic part of the weapon. It doesn't give off that much. So they kind of screwed that up, but if they catch you with that, they can just write you a ticket. And then you have to, if you're from Tennessee, then you got to come back in a month to Gettysburg and go up to Harrisburg and visit with the United States magistrate up there for him to look at that and say, "Nah, you're okay." You know, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's just one of those things that, and I still haven't heard it rescinded yet about the EMF meters. But you can do a really good, discreet paranormal investigation on the battlefield. Just don't bring a group of people, 40 or 50 people. You can't charge anybody because that's a commercial enterprise.
Right.
And for God's sakes, don't bring out the yellow tape, put it around your area there. Just be discreet about it, 2 or 3 people, because you can take pictures and you make recordings.
Right.
At least at Gettysburg, that's how that goes.
Yeah. One of the most well-known, because it's been on all the TV shows, is Jenny Wade House.
Right.
Me personally, it's an interesting story, but I don't understand why that story has been on so many of the TV shows, because I think there's probably more interesting stories at other places around Gettysburg.
I agree. There's a little bit of promotional stuff that goes on in Gettysburg, too. I mean, it's one of the places you can publicly go in, and I guess they charge for you to be led around on a ghost investigation there. As a historian, I spent hours and hours and hours in that house cataloging this is many, many years ago, for the former owner of it, cataloging all the artifacts in there. And, once again, you hear weird things and stuff like that. We did do an investigation of it, a formal investigation of it. And medium, we actually used a medium in this time, and she was pretty well known. There's a chain down in the basement that separates the two halves of the basement, and it allegedly moves on its own. And it started moving while we were there. She said, I don't think Jenny Wade is haunting this place at all. And I said, well, what about the chain? She said, that's Jenny's father. Previously, she had said she felt, as soon as she walked in the house, she said, I feel an unfinished mourning, MOURNING.
Yeah.
And it just so happens that when Jenny Wade, for the people out there who don't know, is the only civilian killed in the 3-day battle. In the Jenny Wade house, she was accidentally, it was an accidental shot that went through 2 doors, an outside door and an inside door, and hit her in the back and killed her instantly. So then she became the only civilian killed in the 3-day battle. But her father at the time was kind of a town ne'er-do-well. He drank a lot, and he did some things, and he was in prison at the time for larceny. And so when his daughter was killed, he couldn't be there, and I don't even think they let him out she was buried several times, so I don't know how much mourning he had an opportunity to do.
Yeah.
But according to our medium, that was him that moves that chain as an indication that he's there, and maybe he misses his daughter, or he missed the fact that he couldn't attend one of her funerals. So, but that's the only story I have. Now, other things obviously have happened since then that they talk about. I haven't been back there since then. But you're right. Well, there are other houses. There are other places in town that are just as active. Interestingly enough, some of the B&Bs are active. So if people want to go and stay the night, then they can do that too. Balladary Inn is out on Hospital Road, where there are a large number of the Union hospitals. That place is pretty active. We use them, as a matter of fact. We do haunted crime scenes weekends, where we bring in a professor of forensics. We pick a crime, and then we try and get some more information about the crime using paranormal means. In other words, talking to victims, talking to witnesses that may not be around anymore. And the Balladary Inn is where we go with that. when you're making a reservation in Gettysburg, you can always ask. I mean, there are a lot of modern hotels too, that have ghost stories associated with them. So it's all over.
Yeah, and then coming up in August, the big Gettysburg Bash, as it's called in the paranormal, and that's the kind of the huge paranormal weekend out there.
I'll be there this year again. It'll be my fourth year, I guess, in a row. But yeah, it's huge. It's huge. Are you coming to Gettysburg for that?
I am going to try to make it out there. I've got a few other friends who have been trying to get me to come out, and they're like, you have to. It's so much fun. You get to meet so many other paranormal investigators and all that. And so, yeah, I'm going to try to make it out that way this year. Yeah,
it's really grown. It's gotten huge. And there are a large number of people that are there. They have there's that one, and then there's one in Ohio as well. I guess they're both about, maybe the one in Ohio is closer to you. There's one in Mansfield, Ohio that goes on.
Yeah.
But they're a lot of fun. It's pretty hectic, but they're a lot of fun.
Yeah. And like I said at the beginning of the show, if people come out to Gettysburg, they can take one of your tours. You offer different tours and they can find that at ghostofgettysburg.com.
Absolutely, yeah. And we have a calendar on there. I believe the calendar's up now. We're not open, but we will be open very soon. I mean, it's springtime, and it's time to start moving around, and we're hoping for a good season this year. We'll have all our tours going before too long. And of course, summertime is the big time for us. But that's the ghosts. It's plural because there's somebody else that's got it's singular, but ours is ghostofgettysburg.com. You got it right, Eric. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, and I love doing ghost tours. It's just so much fun. Even people that are just interested in the history and come out there for the history. You know, I like to tell everybody that, you know, the paranormal is part of the history as well.
Oh, yeah, definitely, yeah. And in fact, we just came out with an app of a ghost tour of the battlefield. Now, we can't take you out on the battlefield. Like I said, that's against the law. That's a commercial enterprise. Right. But we have written an app that you can download into your phone and take a ghost tour of the battlefield. And that's also available through our website there. Just about everything books and tours, and the app can be, you can look at those on there on our website.
And you have 8 of the Ghosts of Gettysburg books, right?
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, I'm looking at a pile right here that's going into number 9. I think I've got 4 chapters done on Ghosts of Gettysburg 9. So keep your fingers crossed. I don't want to say it'll be out this summer, but I'd sure like it to be.
Yeah. And all of your books, including your historical books as well, are all on Amazon and Kindle.
Yes. Yeah, we got those out on Kindle and Amazon, and people can buy them off our website as well. So they're out there.
All right. Mark, thank you so much for coming on and chatting with me today. I've really enjoyed it.
Eric, it's been a pleasure. I appreciate it. And it's neat that you're out there at Franklin. That's a cool place. It's one of my favorite battlefields.
Yeah. If I make it out to Gettysburg, I'll have to come by and see you.
Yeah, definitely. Look me up.
All right. Thank you so much. Y'all have a great day out there. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time. Stay safe. Join us next time for a new episode of The Unseen Paranormal. Until then, head over to the Unseen Paranormal Lounge on Facebook for all the latest updates and discussions about the show. You can also find us on Instagram, Twitter, or at unseenparanormalpodcast.com. And please rate, review, share, and subscribe to help more people discover the show. The Unseen Paranormal Podcast is proud to be the ambassador for paranormal for Verbal.com. A big thank you to my friend Chris Lips for the awesome theme music. You can find more of his music on Apple, Amazon, or Spotify. And as always, thank you for listening. You have come to the